Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video. I hope you're all well in this hectic time we live in. Despite everything that's been going on, the tradition of giving you guys a summary of my academic year at the end of each year in pharmacy school continues. I usually just give you an overview of all the courses that I studied in the year, and then I start to break down each course and tell you how it was and how things went down. Although I usually tend to film these videos after finals, this time around I'm not going to do so because there are no finals, but there is quarantine and year 4 has abruptly ended and I have no idea what just happened. So I am going to film it right now, and technically I'm no longer in year 4, but I'm still not sure what's going to happen with the second term. So I'm not going to include the second term in this video. I'm only going to speak about the first term because this is what has ended and this is what I have the results of, and the only thing that I'm sure of in this year. Now, we're sure that we're not going to be having finals, but I'm not sure what exactly is going to happen. So I'm not going to upload a video about the second term unless I'm actually sure about it, and when I'm actually about to hop into year 5, that's when I'm going to be uploading a second term video. So basically I'm just telling you that this video is going to be about the first term. First of all, here's an overview of all the courses I learned or studied during the first term of the 4th year of pharmacy school. Feel free to pause the video and just check it out for yourself. First and foremost, we have clinical biochemistry and molecular biology. So here's the thing about year 4. It's very much similar to year 3 if we're speaking about the first term of year 4. But the second term of year 4 is completely different from everything that I've studied before. During the second term, I started to study completely new courses that I had no idea about. But during the first term of the 4th year, it was much easier because, for example, during year 3, we studied biochemistry. And during the first term of year 4, we also studied biochemistry. 70% of year 4 was based on previous studies, so it wasn't a complete shock or a sudden change. Whereas the second term was actually a sudden change and I didn't really much enjoy it because it was completely different. Like, it was so different from everything I've studied before. So if you are in year 3, the second term, I definitely do recommend that you study biochemistry really well, because year 4 biochemistry, the clinical biochemistry, has a lot to do with the biochemistry that you study in year 3. And this is what all my professors told me during year 3. They were like, you guys have to really pay attention to biochemistry this term, because the next term, the first thing you're going to study has a lot, like 90% of it is based on what you're studying right now. So if you are in year 3 and you are studying biochemistry, just make sure that you're studying it very well, because a lot of the biochemistry that you're going to take in the future is based on what you're studying right now. I personally really enjoyed clinical biochemistry. Now, all the courses were dense and a lot of them were challenging, but when I say I enjoyed it, I mean it was not a pain to study. There was definitely a lot of information to study and to memorize, but it was nowhere near other courses, and it was very easy actually to study in that it made sense. You just had to sit down and memorize. So what clinical biochemistry means, it has to do with the disease state of the body from the perspective of biochemistry. So for example, in year 3, we studied the normal physiological state of lipid, protein, and carbohydrates metabolism. If you watched the year 3 video that I filmed, then you already know this. It was just about the physiological, non-diseased state, the healthy state of a body, and how metabolism in a normal, healthy body takes place. Clinical biochemistry has to do with the diseased metabolic pathways. So if we studied carbohydrate metabolism and how, like, the Krebs cycle and glucose oxidation and all of those things. In year 4, we studied diabetes. So diseases to do with metabolic processes of like protein, lipid, and carbohydrates. So we definitely did a lot of studies in diabetes, type 1, type 2. Well, actually, one thing that I noticed about year 4 is that we studied a lot of diabetes. Like, a lot of courses would teach us things about diabetes in different manners. So pharmacology would teach us different medications for diabetes, and biochemistry would teach us the defect in metabolism of glucose in diabetes. So different courses would teach us diabetes from different perspectives. That's just a side note. So yeah, clinical biochemistry just basically has to do with the disease state in metabolism. We also study clinical enzymology to do with defective enzymes and also disorders of endocrine functions. Molecular biology was also a part of the course, and it basically was concerned with the DNA, so gene expression regulation, and the PCR. We studied a lot about the machinery of like measuring DNA and like amplifying it. I found it to be very beneficial, and I learned a lot about different things, and I also learned about tumor markers and how to read laboratory values and lab reports. That also is mainly concerned with the practical part of biochemistry. So many of our courses also have a parallel lab that goes with it. So if we're studying something in biochemistry lectures, we would also study similar things in the lab of biochemistry in the same week. So then comes the practical aspect, or the lab of biochemistry. We would have to do three things basically. It would be theoretically studying various disease states from the biochemical perspective. Then we would also perform experiments in the lab, and then we would go on to discuss different cases about those disease states that we studied. In that, we would interpret lab values and lab reports to just kind of give like a rough diagnosis, or just make sense of the case, and then try to answer questions regarding the biochemical perspective of the disease. And again, a lot of year 4 had to do with cases, and so we would study a lot of cases in different courses and try to answer questions on the cases. At the end of the term, we would also take an exam, so we would have like a cases exam basically. And we also had a practical exam in biochemistry, I think 2 practical exams to do with the experiments. Those tend to go very well because, you know, the practical aspect is not as challenging as studying theoretically the cases, but that also went surprisingly well. So there was not much of a struggle in biochemistry that year. Next up, we have phytotherapy. Phyto means plants, and then treatment means therapy. So we were basically just concerned with different disease states and how to treat them using herbs and plant, basically. That's it. Now, I typically or usually just enjoy those types of courses. If you watch my channel, then you know how much I enjoy studying phytotherapy and pharmacology and all those courses to do with treatments using nature and plants. I also liked how they would tackle different approaches to treatment, like Ayurveda, holistic approaches to treatment, and treatment approaches from different parts of the world. So I did enjoy that. We would also learn the difference between herbal supplements, dietary supplements. We would study different disease states, for example IBS, and then we would also take different approaches to treat it using herbal products and plants. We would study the different components of that plant and how it treats or how it helps with that specific disease. So I really enjoyed learning about the intricacies of herbal treatment. And we would also be presented a supplement or a treatment or like a medication that has plants in it. Then we would try to guess, using the ingredients in the label, what it treats and why it treats it. I really enjoyed that because it has a lot to do with real life. A lot of people tend to buy dietary supplements and a lot of them buy herbal products, and they think it's kind of completely different from synthetic medication, but it actually kind of is pretty similar to it. So I enjoyed learning about the differences, the subtle differences, and how to read a label. That's something that you kind of encounter in real life a lot. Phytotherapy was a labless kind of course. It didn't have a lab to go with it, so it was just theoretical. But I would say the way it was presented to us was kind of practical in and of itself. Like the lectures were presented in a practical way. We were presented diseases in the form of cases. So if someone has indigestion, we would not say someone has indigestion. We would say Mary presented with abdominal pain that has been in the upper part, and you know what I mean. So it just kind of explains what happens to Mary and why she was seeking treatment, and then we would be asked what we recommended. Public health. So public health was one of those courses that A, it didn't have a lab to go with it again, and B, we wouldn't study things in great detail, in that we weren't suffering basically. After studying it, you just kind of get a lot of general information in terms of health, but you don't bore yourself with extra detail. We studied, for example, milk pasteurization and the difference between that and sterilization. A lot of it had to do with microbiology. So if you are good at microbiology, you will find public health to be very easy to study. A lot of it had to do with vaccines, and to study vaccines, you have to know the microbe that the vaccine is made for. The only part I didn't enjoy about public health was the environmental factor that it had. We would just randomly, out of nowhere, study how to get rid of waste, like how people get rid of waste in different areas in the world, like the governments. And I didn't really understand why I needed to know that, why I had to study that, but I did study it anyway. It was okay. Pharmacology 3. So I get it. A lot of people hate pharmacology. I mean, yeah, understandable, but it's actually not that bad, especially pharmacology 3. It was just so straight to the point. We didn't have to go through an endless list of medications to study and memorize the names of. So the theoretical aspect of pharmacology, because it did have a lab, the theoretical bits, like the lectures, were actually really straight to the point and were not as bad as previous pharmacology courses that I did study. Again, we'd have different chapters to do with different diseases, and each disease, after studying the physiology of it, we would study the treatment, so the medications that go with it. So for example, in diabetes, we would study the pathophysiology of diabetes first, and then we would go through the different medications to treat diabetes and the different pharmacological classes that are in the market and how they treat diabetes. So one increases the expression of glucose transporters, another class helps increase the excretion of glucose in the kidneys. So it was not as bad and I really enjoyed studying it. But the problem was the lab. I didn't really enjoy the labs as much. Like in the labs, we wouldn't have to handle any animals, or we didn't have to do anything that was too bad. But what we did was just, again, study different diseases in the lab and discuss cases on those diseases. So for example, if we had hormonal imbalance, we would study cases of different hormonal imbalance, and then we would have to discuss the treatment and answer questions on that case up until the exam, the practical exam, that was just a piece of paper that had a case and then, or two cases, and each case had a lot of questions that were multiple choice. We would just discuss the cases together in the lab, and the lab cases were just like this. The exam cases were like this. And it was just completely different, and a lot of cases were intertwined together. So yeah, I didn't really enjoy the exam that much, but I did enjoy the lab, and we did study a lot of different diseases and different treatment approaches basically, and I did learn a lot. I just didn't really enjoy the exams that much. You know, not a lot of people enjoy exams anyway, so that's okay. So another part of the lab, like we did have two practical exams in pharmacology, one to do with cases and different diseases and their treatment, and another to do with another part that we did take and study in the lab. After the first exam was done was drug interactions, so different medications, if you take them together, how they affect each other and how that affects your body basically. So we would study that. So one medication increases the metabolism of another, and then that results in the other medication not being as effective. So we would study different things like that, and then we would take an exam on drug interaction, and it was okay. It wasn't as bad. Maybe because the cases exam was too bad, so they didn't really want to make it too bad as well. So during pharmacology, we also studied antibiotics, which was a completely new subject to us. It had a lot to do with microbiology, so it was not 100% new, but we studied it from the perspective of the drugs themselves, the medications themselves. And I just need to say that if you're studying antibiotics in pharmacology, you need to be very careful and study it very well, because the term after that, you are going to be studying antibiotics again with greater detail, so much detail, in pharmaceutical chemistry too. So just make sure that you're studying it very well during the first term, because the second term is just going to be a lot. But anyways, that was pharmacology 3. Then we have community pharmacy. So okay, I think, looking back in retrospect, it was one of the most beneficial courses that I had studied during year 4. I mean, all of them were really beneficial and I learned a lot naturally, but community pharmacy had a lot to do with basically just different scenarios that would come up in the community pharmacy. Okay, so we had different chapters in community pharmacy. The professor would present to us a certain disease and how it formed, and then we would get a brief description of how the disease is formed and how it's developed, and then we would see the treatment options that we have at the pharmacy and different things that we can do to help the patient in the pharmacy. So if we were studying, for example, childhood rash, we would study how it's formed and different forms of rash, the different options that we had to describe the rash, so that if we're presented with a case of a child with a rash, we would just be able to differentiate between a serious case, so a case that needs to be referred to the doctor, and another that can be responded to at the pharmacy with OTC medication basically. We would also see if someone has a prescription, when to dispense the medication and when to refer that patient back. So again, it can be applied to real life easily. Although I don't really enjoy community pharmacies myself, I did enjoy the course because you can't go wrong with that. So community pharmacy did have a lab to go with it. The good thing is that the labs were so dependent on the lecture. So if in a week we would take a lecture on IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, we would in the lab in the same week study IBS cases, so different case scenarios with different treatment options, and then we would solve questions on that case. So we would just learn how to ask questions in the community pharmacy in the right order to get enough information about the patient, and then we would answer those questions from the case. We discussed a lot of cases from dandruff, childhood rash, athlete's foot, to respiratory problems, digestive issues. So basically the cases that are most likely to show up in the pharmacy. And again, we did have to take an exam on the cases at the end of the term. So again, you kind of get the general consensus is that we had a lot of cases during the last term, and we had to solve a lot of them. So in biochemistry, in community pharmacy, in pharmacology, all of those we studied cases and different approaches and treatments to them. So there are 2 chapters that we did not study in the lab. So they were just on their own without a lab, without a practical aspect to them. We studied a chapter to do with special care patients that need special care, like the pregnant, breastfeeding, geriatric and pediatric patients, and how their bodies basically work differently from the normal adult person. And another part we studied had to do with pharmacy legislation, which I, needless to say, didn't enjoy one bit, but it was just theoretical and you just had to memorize a lot of things and that's it. Then comes the elephant in the room, pharmaceutical chemistry. So at the beginning of the video, I told you guys that most of year 4, the first term, had a lot to do with previous studies, except for pharmaceutical chemistry. It was the first time for us to study it, hence Pharmaceutical Chemistry 1. It was my first time being introduced to pharmaceutical chemistry. Pharmaceutical chemistry had a lot to do with organic chemistry and kind of analytical chemistry as well. So it's kind of a mix of them, as well as giving you completely new information that you had no idea about. It was definitely a bit challenging because it was a chunky course, like you had to go through a lot of information. You're not studying it on its own, you are studying it along with other courses, along with other labs, so it was just a lot. But basically pharmaceutical chemistry had to do with drug development, drug design, making a medication that matches the target in the body, how to design a drug that fits into its target in the body. So if we have a receptor that looks like this, you need to design a drug that looks like this so that it goes into it. Not only that, you also need to design it so that it doesn't leave the receptor too soon, but you also need to design it so that it doesn't keep clinging onto the receptor for too long. So it was just like different approaches like that. Then we would study a structure of different drugs and why they would help in different diseases according to the structures. So structure-activity relationship, we studied a lot of that. We studied an introduction that had to do with prodrugs and how they're designed. How did they become prodrugs? There were different approaches. For example, we would attach something to it structurally so that when it reaches different parts in the body, it would detach from that thing and then it starts doing its action. That's why it's a prodrug. It's not ready to perform the action. We design it so that it doesn't perform the action right when you take it. Either attach something to it and then it detaches, so make sure it's something that can be detached and is biodegradable in that it can be metabolized into something that is not toxic in the body, or you can make a drug that can be converted to an active metabolite through process in the body, so oxidation. And it was just a lot, but it made sense. The only problem I had with it is that we had to go through a lot of information and study it. But now that I've taken pharmaceutical chemistry 2, because I have completed the second term, I am so grateful for pharmaceutical chemistry 1 because it was not as bad and you didn't have to study and memorize the structures. It's just crazy that in the second term we have to memorize structures. During the first term we didn't have to do that. So again, pharmaceutical chemistry was just a little challenging, like a lot challenging, but I found out that pharmaceutical chemistry 2 was a lot more challenging. So now looking back at pharmaceutical chemistry 1, it's not that big of a deal actually. It's actually really good. So if you're studying pharmaceutical chemistry 1, try to make the most of it. Now the lab that goes with pharmaceutical chemistry 1 was split into 2 parts. Dry lab and a wet lab. A dry lab was basically just to do with drug design. The dry lab was basically just a computer lab that we would go into to study how to make a structure fit a receptor using different software programs on the computer. So it was really fun in a way. If you're not a computer savvy, you're going to struggle a bit, but I did really well with the exam at the end. So if you're paying attention, you are not going to struggle that much. The wet lab had a lot to do with organic chemistry. It just looked like organic chemistry to me and analytical chemistry. So we're just studying different experiments and performing them in the wet lab. It was basically just performing experiments in the lab. So that was that. It was okay. It was exhausting just like organic chemistry labs, but the exam was not too bad. It was okay actually. So that was the first term of 4th year. It sounds like a lot. It was a lot, But I would say that all the information that we learned during the first term of fourth year was actually very beneficial and can be applied directly to real life and is very practical. I would say starting from year 3, you start to learn information that you can apply directly to your pharmacy practice in real life, and a lot starts to make sense. It's definitely more stressful, but a lot of it has to do with previous knowledge, and it's not as bad because you're now kind of used to the whole, first of all, pharmacy thing and also uni thing. So you're not as all over the place as you were at the start of pharmacy school. So it gets better, or you get better. It's either one of those. There will be another video on the second term once I'm completely done with it, and I'll be uploading it, so stay tuned for that if you want to watch it. And if you've made it till the end of the video, I applaud you. It was a long one. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and you'll see me in the next video.